Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Scott Duncan. I'm a Professor of Population Health here at AUT. And it's my pleasure to take you through our workshop today. It's the first workshop in the Puketapapa Play Project series of workshops. And I've got my trusty colleagues here with me, Kaushik and Charlotte as well. But what I'm going to do today is go through a bit about play, really, essentially. What is play, what's it all about, and why are we even talking about it? So what I'm going to do first is tell you a little bit about myself, if I can get this thing going. That's my lovely family over there. I have 3 children, Sophie, Ollie, and Jamie. It's a bit of an old photo, actually. The oldest one is 14 now, which is a bit scary. But a lot of my work that I do in the play space, some of it comes from actual research, and some of it, probably most of it, comes from being a dad and learning the hard way about what works and what doesn't work. But what I thought I'd do today is draw on a little bit of some of my personal experience, but also some of the research today, so that you have a backing and a knowledge of where we're at as an academic field in terms of play and screens and just the general child development. And hopefully that'll give you some rationale for why we think this project, the Puketapapa Play Project, is such a cool project. I should also mention I'm a Ross School boy, so I went to Ross School Grammar for 6 years of my schooling. Before that, I was at Gladstone School, which is a little bit further towards Mount Albert. But I do love Mount Ross School. I know it very well. Although I don't live there now, I still very much enjoy returning there and have a real affinity for the place. So yeah, it's great to be able to come back and work in a professional capacity with Ross School as well, Puketapapa. So how I thought I'd start is just tell you a bit of a story about where we've come. And some of this you'll have experienced firsthand, either as ex-children or as parents yourself. But there have been quite a lot of things that have happened over the last 20 odd years, which has led us to a situation today where we have less play and less freedom for our children than perhaps we once had. And I thought I would start with this particular image here. Now, you may recognize the person in the background. Yes, it is me, a very long time ago. This is when I was doing my PhD with my wife, who's in the foreground there. And we were really interested in children's physical activity, mostly from a health perspective. Obviously, being active is good for kids. Being fit and active is something we want all kids to be. But we thought we'd measure it because we hadn't really measured it at that point before. We used pedometers, which are step counting devices, to see how active kids were over the course of a week. And as you can see there, day by day, they do quite a lot of steps. That's 15,000 to 20,000 steps kids were doing, which is a whole lot more than most adults do. Most adults, if you get 10,000, you're doing very well. We saw a difference between girls and boys. We saw differences across ethnic groups. But the one thing I really wanted to highlight for you is what happens when I show you the weekend. This is weekday activity. And I'm going to flick over to the weekend activity, and you'll see how much that falls down. And at the time, this was, 2006, 2007, that was a real shock because we all had memories of being outdoors in the weekends, being active, either playing a game of football or something on Saturday morning, and then having the rest of the day outside to do things on your bike or whatever you want to do. And so this was our first glimpse into this life that maybe kids' childhoods aren't quite the same as what ours were. And it makes maybe the problem is in this weekend or this downtime. What's happened to the outdoor play? Since then, some more work done by a former student of mine, Dr. Julie Bosali, looked at generational differences. So she measured these things in children, but also asked a whole bunch of questions, equivalent questions, to their parents when they were asked to imagine back when they were the same age as their kids. And you can see there's been a lot of changes in just one generation. How many people, kids actively travel to school, how many are allowed to cycle on the main road unsupervised, how many are allowed to be out after dark unsupervised, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it's just a sign that there has been major changes in the way we parent our children and what they're exposed to in the course of their development. That's only in the course of one generation. One of the other things we noticed was there was a increase in the number of structured activities that children have, almost a doubling of structured activities. And so we've noticed, I guess, not just from our quantitative work in this way, but also from our qualitative work, that the nature of what kids do in a given week has changed, not just from a reduction in that free outdoor roaming play, but also an increase in structured activities, things that they have to fit in their day. So this is all of interest to us. Of course, along came screens. That's of no surprise to anyone. That's been another big development over the last 10 or 15 years, the increase of the portable screen. We now say that this is the first generation of children that will be able to unlock an iPad before they can walk. And so it's a very different experience for us parents. This is just a little highlight of some work that we did recently with the Growing Up in New Zealand study. You don't have to look into too much detail because I'll summarize it for you. But essentially, we found that kids that exceeded screen time guidelines at a very young age, by the time they got to school age, they had a much higher risk of being overweight, of having lower motor skills, having more doctor's visits, being hyperactive. And so there's a range of outcomes which we know aren't so good when people exceed screens. I'm not going to go into screens in too much detail here because that's a whole other lecture, but I just did feel the need to touch on it. Obviously, the number of screens that children have access to these days is a big factor in what they can and can't do outside of the home. And then we've had COVID, of course. We know now from some work that's done just this year that children's physical activity generally decreased during the pandemic, which is a bit of a shame. You would think sometimes you'd have more time to potentially go outside, but it seems to be the opposite. But if an increase was detected, it was related to unstructured and outdoor activities. But has it returned to normal? We don't know yet because obviously it's still too new. But we do know that certainly there was an increase in screen time, a spike in screen time, and a decrease in physical activity during the pandemic. And it has seemed to, from what early studies have come out, it has seemed to persist a little bit post-pandemic, if you like, if we can call it ourselves post-pandemic. So there is that impact as well. Something's really forced our hand a little bit and made us realize we have to do something about this fairly urgently, because we don't want the next generation of children to go through life without having experienced some of this free outdoor unstructured activity. I should also mention at this point, please feel free to jump in. I should have said that at the beginning. I do like an interactive workshop rather than me just barking on at you for however long I've got. I tell this to students as well, please just jump in, interrupt me, I'll stop. If you have anything to say, obviously unmute yourself so I know you're talking, but please feel free if you have anything you want to add in, just do it. I will ask you specifically later on, but of course, please do interrupt me. So we have this concept of an endangered species. This is Tim Gill, who's a famous writer and activist. Humans are disappearing from the outdoors at a rate that would make them top any conservationist list of endangered species. And so there is a whole movement of people, such as this chap, he's one of the foremost proponents of this, who are trying to get children to return to outdoor play. They're trying to get them to experience the natural world. So a lot of this is also experiencing the natural world, and we know that's very good for us as well. But play is on the front page of this agenda, really, to get kids back out playing. And how do we do that? What's the best way of doing that? Because we know it's good for us. Play. What is play? Why do we play? It's a funny old thing, play, because every animal does it. Every sort of relatively advanced mammal plays at a young age. Yet it seems to be dangerous. Seems to be a waste of energy. Why do we bother playing? Why is it not being evolved out? Why are we still doing it? Why do kids do this? And why do they want risk through play? Why do they get themselves into tricky situations through play? This is a chance for you to chip in. If you want to answer this question, why is play good for us when it's obviously can be risky and dangerous, and it uses up energy that we could otherwise be using for keeping ourselves alive? Why is this thing still across the whole animal kingdom, this concept of play?
It's enjoyment.
Enjoyment, yeah.
Yep.
Just for the sake of it.
Yes.
Why would that benefit us? And how does that benefit the human condition?
So we can use our imagination.
Yep, imagination. Perfect. So it develops imagination, creativity. Mm-hmm. Anyone else sitting close enough to a mic? They say you can simulate events, you can simulate fighting, battles, you can develop social skills, when's too far, when's not too far. But it's something that seems to be very consistent across the animal kingdom, and it's something that obviously is very good for us. When you take play opportunities away from any animal, actually, they can't socialize at a later date. So it's something that's very important. I don't really, want to dwell on it too much for a group of educators such as yourselves who know probably very well the value of play. But nonetheless, it is something that we should probably think about what we mean by play. What is play? Is playing soccer play? It is a form of play, but is it play in the context we're talking about today? The sort of play I want to talk about, the play that perhaps is disappearing a little bit from children's lives, or at least decreasing, is this type of play, a play that's intrinsically motivated, it's self-directed. Very importantly, it's child-initiated, which means that it isn't driven by parents or driven by teachers. There's no rewards. It can be creative and imaginative, as we discussed, and it's not bound by rules. This is one of the definitions that's been put in place for some time about what we talk about when we talk about play as a broader concept. There's specific types of play, which I'll talk about a little bit, but just in general, it's something which doesn't have rules, that comes from a child, that is creative and imaginative. It's all these really cool things that help their development. But less and less, as I said, kids are getting exposed to this. And even Sporty and Z, as you can see there, picked up on this definition and some of their definitions of play. They're getting very much in the play space in the last few years. So what we've done previously is we've worked with a lot of parents, we've worked with a lot of teachers. And in one of these pieces of work, we asked parents to pick an image, describe an image of what they think of as play in the 21st century for their children. What defines play? They could just think of it off the top of their head, what defines play? And this is the image they got, this one here. And for most parents, this is sort of play. This is a play piece of equipment. So this is, you'll see this all over the city. It's what we call a static piece of equipment. It has a very specific purpose, being obviously designed by an adult for certain purposes. And it has its place. It allows the parent to sit down, have a coffee, talk to their parent, and allow their child to play. But what you'll notice from this sort of static piece of equipment is that often you'll find children after about 10 or 15 minutes, when they've exhausted all the possibilities of this type of piece of equipment, they start to think of new ways of using it. They start climbing up the slide backwards. They start trying to get to the top of something and jumping off all the way to the bottom. The sort of things that usually generate a stop that, get down from that, from their parents. Because they've run out of ideas, right? There's only a certain amount of things you can do with this type of piece of equipment. And so it's not what I would call the most creative and imaginative form of play, and yet that seems to be where we've sort of stuck to for the last few years. It's starting to sort of creep a little bit better. You'll see playgrounds getting better and better because people are starting to realize that things need to actually be a bit more fluid. But this is, what the current state of affairs is in terms of play. Another image that was drawn out was this type of play. So this is fast play. Bikes are great, obviously. What do you notice about this image, though, that might sort of speak to the current state of affairs in terms of play in New Zealand? Don't know how easy it is for you to speak, so I'm just going to keep going, but please feel free to interrupt.
She's got knee pads, elbow pads, all the safety gear.
Yeah, all the stuff. Yeah. And so what message is that sort of telling that girl?
It's overprotective.
Yeah. For me, that would sort of tell the message that, hey, you're going to fall off. Well, I don't trust you not to fall off. And secondly, if you fall off, there's multiple points of contact. You're going to get hurt. It's going to be a bad experience for you. And so what I'm getting at here, I guess, is that not only do we have to create environments that allow kids to play, but we have to create the license for them to play in the way they wish. So there's training wheels as well, which is another pet peeve of mine. But nonetheless, there is this concept of overprotecting children. And you've seen this in the media and all the cotton wooling articles that come out. A lot of our workers in that space trying to reverse that symptom, which has come up somehow through the social norms of our society, that they have to overprotect your children and they can have zero accidents and never be injured and all that sort of stuff. What about this type of play? Is another type of play? Good, bad, average? What do we think of this? This does actually exist. This is an actual piece of equipment you can purchase. But again, not all screens are bad. Some screens are okay. Some screens, it depends what you do in them. But again, this is also part of the play environment for children. This is part of play. And we're seeing more and more of this now. That's supplanting time that could be spent doing other things. So I have another option. See what I think of this option. How does that play compare to the previous play we just talked about? I think it's pretty cool. We'd never get away with it here, of course. But just the thrill, the learning, the underlying danger behind the whole thing. It's an experience you can see, hopefully, comparing it to the pictures I just showed you, that is just chalk and cheese. Like these are experiences that that will offer so much to children. Yes, there is an element of risk. Yes, there is. And perhaps that risk goes too far for what you might be considered appropriate for your school or your environment. But nonetheless, you can't argue that if it works pretty well. So that's where I'm getting to. I'm heading this long diatribe is heading towards this thing called risky play. Risky play. And there is a term called risky play. It exists out there in the literature. If you want to read up about this, Professor Mariana Brusoni from the University of British Columbia is probably the foremost authority on risky play. And that's a review article there I referenced because she's talked about the benefits of risk in play. And you know, we've covered it at this point a little bit about play in general, but what I would really like to talk about, and specifically in respect to the school environment, is this concept of potentially bringing a little bit of risk into play. Because we know that if you add some risk to play, not only is it our greatest hook to get children off screens, because it's the one thing that they really love to do, but it also develops things like social skills, well-being, motor skills, which are very important, and that counteracts potentially the effect of screen time on motor skills. Cognition, creativity, communication, it's fun, they're more active, and of course that last thing down the bottom, which is really important for me as a dad in particular, is resilience, being able to bounce back when you do fall over or do have bad things happen to you in life. Developing that. We know resilience is innate as well. There's a part of, you know, part of it's you're born with, but you can actually also build your resilience through the experiences that you encounter throughout your childhood. And so that's sort of where we're coming from, at least the AUT team, and I believe I've converted the Sport Auckland guys as well into this idea of risky play, that hey, actually we can do this, and we can do this in schools even. We certainly do it a lot in ECE. We see a lot of it. We see hammers and nails around the place. But for whatever reason, when we get to primary schools, doesn't seem to be quite as acceptable. So I think we can potentially bring a little bit of this, hopefully, in this project. Of course, it's about play, and it's not just about risky play, but this is the real unique aspect, I think. What is risky play? It has been defined for us. So I'm going to help you understand what exactly I mean when I'm saying it. There's a range of different elements of risky play, some of which we could use in schools, perhaps. Adult tools, these are all my personal family picks. Of course, this is my 14-year-old who's not 14 there. But adult tools, not Fisher-Price plastic tools, actual real saws, things that you can build with and create with is one aspect of risky play. Heights, any time that you have a risk of falling, where there's a danger, that's really exciting. And it's something that allows kids to utilize their motor skills to overcome. Like climbing a tree is much more cognitively demanding than climbing a ladder for a playground, because there's more things you have to think about. Rough and tumble games, the old bull rush, wrestling games, that sort of things, playing with sticks, all these sorts of things which are innately fun for kids, but often do get banned by parents. And then we have exploration. This is independent exploration. So this is where you're away from adults and you're doing your own thing. There is still options to do this within schools through areas that are potentially away from well, at least obvious adult supervision. But that's another thing that kids like to do. Natural elements, fire, water, sand, anything natural is also very exciting and cool. And then anything fast where there's a risk of falling. So these are the 6 elements that are discussed, at least in my field, as the things that if you could create a really cool environment for kids to really fire kids up and get them involved in play, having some of these things or all of these things is the way to go. It doesn't all have to be at once, of course. Things change and it will change from week to week, month to month, but having these touchstones is a really cool thing, I think. We've added a couple more too, by the way. Oh, that's the reference. By the way, this is being recorded, so any references I put up here, you can have a look at later. But Ellen Sandsetter, who's, again, one of the really key people in the field, she's from Norway. She's actually gone through in this paper and talked about why kids are attracted to this when it's dangerous stuff. But it's really worth a read if you can find the time. We've also added loose repurposed parts. So this is what we call real play, and we did develop this for a study we did with Purcell. This is really important. So these are things that aren't meant to be played with, that often look a bit junky to adults. But I suspect that pile of junk there, which was actually at a kindergarten that my kids went to, is probably a little bit more attractive to most kids than the perfectly designed and painted piece of equipment that costs $50,000, $60,000. And yet this is very, very cheap. So these are the sort of things we'd really like to see coming back and entering the primary school level as well as the early childhood level. Anytime there's physical challenge where kids have to actually overcome something, problem solve, and do something as a group is really important, but also things that are messy, which again is something we'd like to see a little bit more of, but again it has its barriers and its issues when you're dealing with a lot of kids in a primary school setting, but can be done. And so all these things these are the things that we're sort of going to be harping on at you a little bit about, not only in this workshop, but probably in the next one, which we'll be talking about a few examples of how it can actually be done in schools, but also throughout the duration of the program, when Matt and Taylor and Scott visit you guys and work with you to map out what can be done in your schools. We'll probably be coming back to some of these definitions here because these are the things that we think offer the most benefits to kids. Oh yes, I was going to show you a little picture. This isn't a long one. This is a little clip, a trailer for a show, a documentary that took place a few years ago. It's in Wales. And the reason I'm showing it to you is just when I first saw it, it really opened my eyes to what was possible. I hadn't realized this sort of thing was possible, but I just want to show it to you, and then I'll have a bit of a chat about it afterwards. It won't be long. Hopefully you can see it moving and everything. So that's a documentary called The Land, which you can feel free to have a look at. But for me, it was just I guess an example of what's happening in other countries. So there's quite a big play movement, an adventure playground movement in the UK. There's a little bit actually happening in America. We haven't really got it over here in New Zealand, but it does show you the extent to which you can actually create an environment which really inspires kids to create and do some really cool things. Not that, okay, I'll say this up front, not that I expect any of your schools to look like that, but nonetheless, there is a template there, I guess, for what you could potentially look at partly doing. Because one of the things you'll notice is that playgrounds or play spaces that are attractive to children look very different to play spaces that are attractive to adults. Because that, I imagine, for most parents would look a bit like a rubbish tip, but for a kid would look like an amazingly open-ended exploration opportunity. So there is a bit of a line to walk there between having a school which allows kids to experience a really cool, rich, fun play, but also can be maintained and doesn't get, too many protests from the parents, I guess. But it is happening a little bit in New Zealand. We are seeing some happening. This is we did work with Swanson School and Royal Road School a few years ago, and the next workshop, Bruce McLaughlin is going to be coming and talking to you about his experiences going through this process and showing that it can actually work within the schools. It takes a little bit of learning and a little bit of systems in place, but it can actually work. And kids obviously reap the benefits of that. So one of the things that you'll probably be aware of also is this thing called the Health and Safety and Work Act. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here other than to recognise it and touch on it, because there'll be greater discussions in the second workshop. But obviously, that came out in 2015, and it put personal liability on principals and teachers for maintaining their health and safety duties. And so this led to a little bit of panic in some schools where things were banned, and it had made a mild media splash. But it is also something that tends to or can dictate the sort of things that happen in schools. I've read the Act, I've read the guide that goes alongside it for schools, and the good news is, although it's written by health and safety professionals and there's no mention of child development or anything like that, the good news is that it's very open to interpretation, and it really doesn't affect tree climbing at all. It's really more for hazard avoidance, which is something completely different to risk. So it can certainly be worked around, and one of the ways we suggest it is worked around is by within your health and safety systems using a risk-benefit assessment as opposed to a risk register. Risk-benefit assessment adds another column, essentially, which allows you to look at situations and look at the potential benefits of a situation, of a risk. A risk is different from a hazard. Just to clarify, a hazard is something that will not benefit a child, something like a broken railing. They can't see, they can't benefit from it, but it's very dangerous. You don't want hazard in your school. But risks are appropriate. There are risks in everything we do. Climbing a tree is a good example of a risk. Yes, there's a risk of something bad happening, but there's also great benefits for kids of being able to climb trees. Just as there's a risk for a regular piece of play equipment. There's a risk that kids will get injured, but it's worth having it because of all the benefits that kids get from it. So what we're hoping to be able to do is put this within your schools so that it becomes a part of your standard practice to look through risk-benefit assessments rather than just risk avoidance. Again, that'll be touched in a little bit more detail in the second workshop. So what I thought I'd do is to take you through some of the work we've done as well, just to show you, I guess, what the current state of play is in New Zealand. We've done a couple of surveys now, nationwide surveys on play in New Zealand, and I thought I'd just show you some interesting, or at least I think they're interesting, data that we found. For a start, it probably gives you a bit of an insight into the current way that parents are thinking about play. Obviously, parents are a huge part of anything you do within your school, and so need to be understood and communicated with. And this might help you understand a little bit where they're sitting at the moment. So what we did is we asked a series of questions. I've just picked out some things I think might be of interest to you. One of the things we did ask is at what age children should be allowed to do certain activities. So I've just picked out a few of the ones I think are interesting. Any of the dark yellow is parents saying yes, and the light yellow is parents saying no. So you can see for most parents, it takes a little while before they sort of warm to tree climbing. Not many parents, for example, think that kids less than 2 years should be able to climb trees. But once you get to sort of the 6 to 8 to 9 years to 10 to 12 years, most parents think, yeah, children should be able to climb trees. There is a bit of a slope there, though. There is a bit of a slope. 5-year-olds can actually climb trees, but there's still quite a few parents that don't think they could. This changes depending on what activity we ask. Like, what age should children first be allowed to use adult tools at home? There's a much flatter curve there now. Now it's getting up to a higher age. And then when you ask things like, at what age should children first be allowed to roam the neighbourhood alone, which is of interest of mine as well. I know it's not school related, but nonetheless, I think it's interesting. It's very, very old. The whole independent mobility and roaming the neighbourhood and exploring your neighbourhood. That's one thing in particular. If you could pinpoint one thing that's changed enormously over the decades, it's that particular piece of child development, which has been removed from our kids. And what about your child? We asked them about their own children. These are all parents we've surveyed. How often do they play messy? And you get a bit of a bell curve there. There's a few sometimes and often, not many always. But it's not something that's overly common. Again, you'll shift climbing trees. You're shifting a little bit more to the left. They don't often climb trees. How often do they use adult tools? Not very often. Getting down to the nevers and the seldoms and the sometimes. And then again, roaming the neighbourhood alone always seems to win. In a bad way, I guess. And that this particular question was only asked to parents of 10 to 12-year-old kids. Yeah, I guess it's something that doesn't really happen so much anymore. Oh, that one hasn't come through properly. I'm missing a whole bunch of dots. But what I'll do is I'll summarize it for you. Essentially, the interesting thing that came out of this was that when it came to risky behaviors, and in this example, it's roaming the neighborhood. Parents still remember a time when it was good and that it is good for kids. They still have that memory of having a fairly free-range childhood, and yet they also greatly overestimate the risk of bad things happening. In fact, I guess that's just a natural thing. Part of it is probably through the way the media portrays this at the moment, but there's very much a discordance between actual risk and perceived risk. And that's what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis with parents. And yeah, you'll probably have to deal with that as well. Another cool thing actually we looked at was raining play and wet play, because that's another thing which for whatever reason isn't that common. And we don't see a lot of wet weather play often in primary schools. And it sort of carries on over to the home environment as well. But that's one of the things we do promote is actually raining is awesome. Raining is really fun for kids to be out in. As long as they've got the right equipment, it can actually be a really fun learning, unique experience. And so that's another thing we'll probably be discussing with you is there a way of bringing wet weather play back to primary schools? Is that possible? Can we do it? I know a lot of SEEs, again, they're smaller, yes, easier to manage, but they're doing it. Can we do it in a primary school setting? And this particular graph also, just the last one from this figure, is of interest, I think, because what this found was that the odds of tree climbing, and this was the same for any risky behavior, went up when a parent was more risk tolerant. So we gave them a risk tolerance questionnaire, and we categorized them based on their risk tolerance. And we found that those who were more risk tolerant in general about life would allow their children to do more things. Those that were really risk averse wouldn't. And the good news about that, I guess, is that is something that can be modified. So you can actually move people along that bottom scale through education and experience. And if that's the case, then perhaps that will spill over into actual behaviours that kids are unable to do. So I'm probably going to leave that there. I guess the whole purpose of this was really just to start the discussion